Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this wonderful Tuesday night to hear a wonderful talk as a part of our Lane Lyceum. Amy, not to put you on the spot, but did you want to explain our Lane Lyceum program? You just do such a beautiful job of it every time that me doing it, I feel like would be an inferior experience.
Well, I wasn't expecting this, but it is, the continuing ed committee has been really delighted to continue the Lane Lyceums, which have been going on since John Buren started them many, many years ago. And but they're also part of a tradition in New England for groups of people to come together to discuss important ideas and to discuss them, to analyze them, to debate, to get into a head to head. And so that's what our lyceums are. Hopefully we won't do that, Reverend Catie. So this is a continuation of our Lane Lyceums, and I did want to mention that we have another one coming up on gender pronouns next week, and that also should be, I think, very valuable to so many of us who are not always comfortable with people's use of pronouns these days, and wanting to be respectful, but also not always knowing what's the best. So just want to point that out. And if there's anybody who's not on our mailing list, if you want to put your email address into the chat, I will add you to our ongoing mailing list. Okay, so take it away, Sarah Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Amy. And thank you for also reminding us about the upcoming Lane Lyceum next week. I have put a link in the chat in case you wanted to go to the church website where we have all the Zoom information and that there. So I am really excited to introduce First Parish in Needham's own Reverend Catie Scudera. Just to give you a short plug about Reverend Catie, in case you don't know much about her, Reverend Catie has served as lead minister here at First Parish since 2014 and has been the co-president of the Needham Interfaith Clergy Association since 2021. She also previously served as a board member of the Unitarian Universalist Partner Church Council, as the intern minister of Arlington Street Church in Boston, as the student and summer minister of the Winchester Unitarian Society in Massachusetts, and as a student chaplain at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. Before responding to her call for ministry, Reverend Catie co-founded the A. Margaret Barr Children's Village and Reverend Catie, would you mind saying this town for me? I want to incorrectly pronounce
Mouse injury.
Thank
or
you.
Kerrang. I don't know which one I put on there.
Oh, it's
with the M. Mouse injury.
MGH. Yeah.
Oh, in Meghalaya.
Meghalaya, thank you, in Meghalaya, India. So she co-founded the A. Margaret Barr Children's Village in Meghalaya, India, with the Unitarian Union of Northeast India, and served as a full-time tutor at Match High School in Boston. She is a 2007 Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh and earned her Master of Divinity in 2012 from Harvard Divinity School. And she currently lives in Needham Heights with her spouse, toddler, and 2 rescue dogs. So she's only done a couple of things, not a lot, but hopefully Reverend Catie is wonderful, and we're so excited to hear from her per presentation, Something Evil This Way Comes, a history of UU understandings of evil, based on her, in part based or coming from her master's thesis at Harvard. So with that, I'm going to let her take the spotlight, share the screen with her PowerPoint, and we'll get started. Thanks for coming, Reverend Catie.
Thank you so much, Sarah Elizabeth, and many thanks to our continuing ed team for all your work that makes the Lane Lyceum series so vibrant in memory of our member of blessed memory, Reverend Ed Lane. And Sarah Elizabeth, oh, okay, I didn't need to ask. There we go. Oh, hello, it's my slides. Welcome, everyone, to this Lane Lyceum lecture. I appreciate you all taking the time tonight to hear this presentation. Something Evil This Way Comes, a history of UU understandings of evil. We know that evil, wickedness, suffering do come into our lives despite our best efforts to avoid them. So when something wicked this way comes, it often begs a few questions. Whence does it come? Why does it exist? Does evil serve a purpose? Why do bad things happen to good people? What do we do about evil? And tonight you will hear some thoughts on these matters from our UU spiritual ancestors and contemporaries. First, though, I have for us a definition of evil, like any of you would do. I Googled it. Look at this. This is a great short summary of what evil is according to Wikipedia. Evil, in a general sense, is defined as the opposite or absence of good. It can be an extremely broad concept, although in everyday usage, it is often more narrowly used to talk about profound wickedness and immorality against the common good. It's generally seen as taking multiple possible forms, such as the form of interpersonal and systemic moral evil, which was commonly associated with the word, or impersonal natural evil, as in the case of natural disasters or illnesses. My own commentary I'll put in here, as some of you have surely thought of already. Natural disasters and illnesses are not free from moral evil. Humans can be complicit in a hurricane destroying a home or a deadly disease running rampant in a community or globally. If those complicit humans have helped perpetuate the climate crisis and capitalist unfair economic conditions that result in unsafe housing structures or the hoarding of life-saving vaccines and medications. We'll get more into natural evil in the upcoming Sunday service on March 19th. And now we'll go back to our definition from Wikipedia. The philosophical and ethical questions regarding good and evil are subsumed into three major areas of study: meta-ethics concerning the nature of good and evil, normative ethics concerning how we ought to behave, and applied ethics concerning particular moral issues. And religious traditions, of course, also address evil. In certain religious contexts, evil has been described as a supernatural force or persona in a cosmic battle between good and evil. Elements that are often associated with personal forms of evil include anger, revenge, hatred, selfishness, ignorance, destruction, violence, prejudice, neglect, and anything causing suffering and trauma. I'll be addressing moral evil in this lecture, and like one of our Singing the Living Tradition hymns, sharing with you my research into three major questions, which I think we'll get to. There it is. Oh, beautiful.
Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where do we come from? Mystery, mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery. Mystery, mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery. Where do we come from?
Thank you, Sarah Elizabeth. Where do we come from?
Where
What
do
are
we
we?
come from?
Where? Oh, exactly. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? And so what is the spiritual problem with evil? Depending on your religious and philosophical tradition, the existence of evil is explained in myriad ways. During this presentation, I'll be focusing on theodicy, the problem of evil from Christian, Unitarian, Universalist, and Unitarian Universalist perspectives. This is because, as many of you know, modern Universalism and Unitarianism came out of Protestant Reformation era radical reinterpretations of the Christian Bible and theology, developing heretical theologies that in fact had been actively suppressed since the First Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, that was Unitarianism, and the Second Council of Constantinople in the 6th century CE, that was Universalism. But this is not a Lane Lyceum about Universalist or Unitarian theology broadly writ, so that's all I'll say about that for tonight. Our theological history with Christianity is essential to note because for centuries, our Unitarian and Universalist spiritual ancestors were wrestling with evil from the perspective of Christians, which means that they were wrestling with theodicy, which translates to the justice or the righteousness of God. You see, the problem of evil from a Christian perspective is that if God is all-powerful, omnipotent, all-knowing, omniscient, and all-good, omnibenevolent, how do you explain why bad things happen to good people? How can God still be just and good in the context of the actual world? Our member of blessed memory, Ed Lane, for whom this Lyceum series is now named, shared with me years ago this little excerpt from Scottish-American writer, professor, veteran, and librarian of Congress, Archibald MacLeish's play, J.B. I heard upon this dry dung heap that man cry out who cannot sleep. If God is God, he is not good. If God is good, he is not God. Modern Euro-American Christian Bible scholar and professor Dr. Bart Ehrman lost his childhood Christian faith over this issue and wrote a whole book studying the topic of God's goodness and suffering called God's Problem, how the Bible fails to answer our most important question, why we suffer. I'm also, with Sarah Elizabeth's help, going to try to zoom in on this comic strip from Saturday morning breakfast cereal that explains the problem of evil perfectly, albeit with more colorful language than I typically use in church contexts. I don't know if that's possible, Sarah Elizabeth. Is it? Oh, look at you. All right. We'll see if Google Slides will let us bigify that.
It's possible if you give me just a moment to figure it out while you talk. You can come back to this comic in one moment.
Yes. Oh, yes, you did spot that slide. You could click the link that Peter just put into the chat. I could start reading as I was going to anyway. Oh, what it says. Ooh, very nice. All right, we're starting at the top. God, it says, is like a table held on 3 legs, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. On top of the table is a ball called theodicy. The ball is out of reach, but we want it. We can get the ball by shortening any one of the legs, shortening omniscience through free will, shortening omnipotence through God has bigger concerns than you, and omnibenevolence through God works in mysterious, dickish ways. Each releases the ball, but makes the table ugly. For most people, this is disturbing. Just kidding, most people don't care. And in all fairness, it's probably better than the alternative. What does skepticism offer? A wondrous, beautiful, doesn't give a crap about you cosmos. And that's the, all right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for that comic. So tonight we begin with where do we come from with the problem of evil. I'm going to share with you the various ways that Christian Universalists, Unitarian, and Unitarian Universalists have tried to get the ball of theodicy. Or for those of us who don't believe in a classical triple omni God, at least get the ball of what evil is, why we suffer, and what to do about it. And you may be wondering why I happen to know so much specifically on this topic. As I preached in a sermon 2 Sundays ago, 19th century Unitarians in particular had an extremely optimistic type of theological anthropology. They believed, as our spiritual ancestor, Euro-American Unitarian minister, Reverend James Freeman Clarke, put it, they believed in humanity's progress, onward and upward forever. As I also said in that sermon, World War II put an end to that optimism for a time. But by the turn of this century, we Unitarian Universalists had become once again very optimistic about the human condition, perhaps too optimistic again. And this included me. I don't know if you've noticed, but I am a very hopeful sort of person. Usually quite skilled at finding a silver lining and common ground. I personally believe this is fine. However, when I was going through the ordination and fellowshipping process to become a Unitarian Universalist minister, I was told about halfway through my seminary career that I needed a much more robust theology of evil. I was much too much like Reverend James Freeman Clarke. So, like any good eldest daughter and former gifted kid, I wrote a 14,000-word master's thesis at Harvard Divinity School on evil. And this is just a quick content warning that the images on our next slide are from 9/11. As a millennial American, especially one who was born in Manhattan and grew up just outside Washington, D.C., 9/11 was a huge turning point and tragedy for me. If you were on the Northeast Seaboard at that time, I imagine it had a huge impact on you too. So I focused my master's thesis on 9/11, the really big bad thing that happened for 21st century Unitarian Universalists, similar to World War II for 20th century Unitarians. I did write my thesis back in 2011, so the pandemic had not happened yet. My thesis was titled, May Nothing Evil Cross This Door, another one of our hymns, Unitarian Universalist Understandings of Evil from 1991 to 2011. I also presented an updated paper on this topic to the Greenfield Group, a biannual study gathering of UU ministers. So let's begin with our UU theological history. Where did we come from? Rooted in Christianity. Any survey of Christian theodicy ought to start with the stories of evil deeds and evil spirits throughout the Christian Bible. And here's an account of some of the instances and explanations of evil in the Bible. In the beginning, to borrow a phrase, a serpent is in the utopian garden of evil, successfully tempting Eve and Adam to break God's commandments, although Adam and Eve had been made in God's likeness, so one would think perhaps they were incapable of evil. By Genesis chapter 4, the first murder takes place, the fratricide by Eve and Adam's son Cain of their son Abel. Later, in punishment for disbelief and whining, the Hebrews who left enslavement in Egypt were led astray by God to be lost in a desert. The book of Job, seen here, is a meditation on why bad things happen to good people in light of evil being assumed as a punishment for sin in much of the Jewish Tanakh. If in all of the 4 gospel narratives of the Christian New Testament, Jesus encounters and defeats demonic forces, and in the canonized letters of the evangelist Paul, he introduces the seed of the idea of original sin, that through Adam and Eve, all of humanity inherited sinful tendencies. The Christian Bible is inconsistent in its explanations of God's purpose and governance over such pain and suffering in the world. Sometimes it is as punishment for sin, as in an evil spirit tormenting King Saul. Sometimes it's to show God's power, as in the plagues of Egypt. And sometimes God refuses to be questioned on such matters, as in Job, which, as you may know, was a bet between God and a Satan on whether Job would keep his faith if God let Satan ruin his life. I believe, yeah, and this is actually a depiction of Job's extremely unhelpful friends who come to talk to him about why everything has gone wrong, going through these sorts of explanations, and none of them quite work because Job is such a faithful man. Without a clear biblical answer, questions of how evil came to be in a God-created world and why it is allowed by a triple omni-God became central inquiries in Christian theology. In terms of theodicy, the most influential early Christian theologian was 5th century North African church father, Bishop Augustine of Hippo. Augustine struggled to reconcile his everyday experience of temptation and evil with his firm conviction that God was both all-powerful and all-good. Influenced by the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato and Plotinus. Sorry, I'm like, did I look up how to pronounce that? I didn't, and I didn't study philosophy. Augustine believed that God and all of God's creation is indeed good, and that everything with being is good. Thus, Augustine wrote that evil is a non-being, the absence or privation of goodness. Further, Augustine absolves God's responsibility for evil because God gave humans free will to choose evil deeds. This seems to contradict God's omnipotence and omniscience, but Augustine wrote that God foreknows what choices humans will make, and that it is God's grace that causes righteous decision-making, not that our goodness elicits God's grace. Augustine believed that even the smallest sin, which all are guilty of, Augustine famously used babies crying as an example of this, as you see on the screen. Even the smallest sin is grounds for eternal damnation, but God's mercy saves. To some, including me, Augustine's line of reasoning isn't quite intelligible. However, Christian theodicy found its cornerstone in the writings of Augustine. In the 11th century, The Catholic and Orthodox churches broke off from one another with many important theological differences, and we'll follow the through line into our religious tradition through Catholicism. In the 13th century, Italian Catholic priest and theologian Thomas Aquinas offered some important glosses to Augustine's understanding of evil. First, Aquinas wrote that because God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, our created universe must be the best of all possible iterations of a created universe. And second, because our universe is the best that it could be, Aquinas argued that God must allow some evils to happen to bring about an overall greater amount of goodness. For example, Adam and Eve's original sin against God would eventually necessitate bringing Jesus into the world. "O fortunate crime," Aquinas wrote, "which merited such and so great a redeemer." Therefore, for Aquinas, there is no genuine evil in the world. Once one's perception is given a God's eye view, one sees that all is leading to optimal goodness. Individual people are saved by their faith in the Roman Catholic triune God and their good works their faith compels them to do. Without poverty and suffering, how could there be charity and altruism? Some of you may be wondering, where's the devil in all this? A great question. In Judaism and the Jewish scriptures, Satan, with a lowercase s, is the accuser or adversary. That's what the Hebrew word means. And as mentioned earlier, Satan is featured prominently in the story of Job, as seen here with Satan torturing poor Job. In Jewish traditions, Satan is not really a big deal. He and God are not enemies. But in the 3rd century BCE Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures, Satan was translated as the Satan, and we were off. In all the Christian New Testament writings, which were written in Greek or Aramaic, Satan is an individual persona. You see him being banished there on the right. The devil is his own actor and influences other wrongdoers who were contemporaries of Jesus, the apostles, and later evangelists. It is very, very, very likely that Roman religion, European paganism, and other non-Jewish spiritual influences contributed to the character of Satan in Christianity. Over the centuries of Christian thought, Satan became an embodiment of evil, a tempter, like the snake in the Garden of Eden, who is not identified as Satan in the Jewish scriptures, a fallen angel punished by God and working in opposition to God's purposes, but never more powerful than God, but bad things still happen, so we're back again at the problem of evil devil or no devil. If you want to learn more about the devil in Christian thought, I highly recommend The Origin of Satan by Euro-American scholar and professor Dr. Elaine Pagels. On a personal note, The Origin of Satan was the first book of contemporary theology that I ever read, and it blew my mind and ignited in me a passion for modern progressive biblical interpretation. And so now we're reaching the 16th century and the Protestant Reformation, bringing us to the resurgence of Universalist and Unitarian theologies. Leaders of the Protestant Reformation changed or discarded many of the doctrines and practices of Roman Catholicism, yet they still did not move far from Augustine in terms of theodicy. German ex-Catholic priest and theologian Martin Luther, who was the first protesting reformer or Protestant reformer, he thought it was perverse for humans to even feign understanding of why evil occurs in the world, as our knowledge pales in comparison to God's knowledge. Luther had clearly read the book of Job. However, Luther did believe that the desires of the flesh are the source of all sinfulness, and that no person can escape sin because we are all embodied. His belief followed directly from medieval Catholic thought, which also saw the body as sinful and the mind or spirit as potentially pure. But Luther argued that a person is saved by their faith and God's grace alone, not by the doing of good deeds. In the case of French ex-Catholic theologian and preacher John Calvin, he took much of his theology directly from Augustine's writings and followed Augustine's beliefs to their logical conclusions. Like Augustine, Calvin believed that it was God's grace, the election of an individual person, that caused righteous behavior, not that God's grace was earned by righteous behavior. Furthermore, Calvin claimed that all people are totally depraved, incapable of following God's laws unless they have received God's grace, which was God's choice alone to give. Though Augustine emphasized a person's responsibility and free will in ultimately choosing right or wrong, Calvin asserted that because God is the creator and designer of all things, a person can only choose what they are predestined to do in God's plan, including eventual entrance into heaven or hell. Calvin still argues that every person is given a will and thus is a free and responsible agent for their choices, but his understanding of free will is so wrapped up in God's design that it's hardly recognizable as free. Both our Unitarian and Universalist traditions primarily come from John Calvin's branch of Protestantism, though the 1553 City Council of Geneva, a city under John Calvin's theological and governmental rule, did burn at the stake an early Unitarian heretic, Spanish physician and polymath Miguel Serveto. There were plenty of Unitarians and Universalists cropping up around Europe in the 1500s, but we have two more important spiritual predecessors to remember before we get into understandings of evil from 19th century UUs. One is 16th century Dutch Reformed minister and theologian Jacobus Arminius, who argued against predestination and reasserted a stronger theology of human free will as an essential good. The other important spiritual ancestor was 17th century German polymath Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. You remember that Thomas Aquinas' belief that our world generates the most possible goodness, as in the world was optimized for goodness. It was Leibniz who coined the phrase that our world is the best of all possible worlds, relying on the classic belief that the Christian God is omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent. Leibniz contended that God must know all possible iterations of the world, and out of God's goodness, God must have chosen to create the best one. In our best world, Leibniz wrote that sin and suffering always lead to a greater good. Thus, any vice is not actually evil, for it eventually brings about the maximum quantity of good. And as I promised, we're finally getting into our Unitarian Universalist ancestors. Huzzah! I hope that you're still with me, more or less, out there in the ether of Zoom. Both Universalism and Unitarianism thrived as radical Christians in the United States during the 18th and early 19th centuries. Unitarians and Universalists took issue with different common doctrines related to humanity, God, and evil. One of the primary differences between the liberal Unitarian and the conservative Congregationalist branches of New England Puritanism was that the Unitarians did not believe the Calvinist doctrines of total human depravity nor of predestination. Early Unitarians believed a classically Arminian, as in Jacobus Arminius, a classically Arminian stance that every person has the moral capacity and responsibility to freely choose between good and evil. Universalists broke with mainline Christian Protestantism because they could not believe that an omnibenevolent God would send any person into infinite damnation for finite sins, no matter how much evil a person had done, nor that Jesus' salvific power had any limit. All of humanity was saved from original sin by Jesus' sacrifice. Often quoting from the evangelist Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 5, Universalists said, just as one man's, Adam's, trespass led to condemnation for all, so one man, Jesus's, act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all. For just as by the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. Like Paul, Aquinas, and Leibniz, 19th century Euro-American Universalist minister Reverend Hosea Ballou wrote that evil and sin were intended for good because it necessitated the atoning grace of Jesus. In the early 1800s, the New England Convention of Universalists adopted the Winchester profession, which included that God would return the whole family of humankind to holiness and happiness, and that holiness and true happiness are inseparably connected. Creating a heaven on earth required absolute goodness from all people with the help of an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God. In contrast, our Euro-American Unitarian forebear, Reverend William Ellery Channing, decried universal salvation in his 1832 sermon, The Evil of Sin, stating that the theological stance tends to diminish the dread of sin and thus diminish righteous behavior. Channing and other early 19th century Unitarians believed humans were ultimately responsible and posthumously accountable for all of their actions. People were saved by good character and work against evil. Another Euro-American Unitarian minister, Reverend Theodore Parker, focused less on the personal sins and instead preached that evil was born through transpersonal and social sins. Unsurprisingly, he and Euro-American activist and writer Lydia Maria Child became among the most vocal Unitarian abolitionists. Parker was confident evil could be overcome. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe, Parker wrote. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but a little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight, but I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure that it bends toward justice. You may recognize these phrases from Black civil rights leader and Baptist minister Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who studied Parker's works during his doctoral program at nearby Boston University School of Theology. Three of our best-known Unitarian transcendentalists in the mid-1800s were in disagreement with what evil was, but echoed earlier Christian thought. Euro-American lecturer, essayist, and Unitarian minister Ralph Waldo Emerson, in Augustinian fashion, described evil as an absence of good. His friend, Euro-American writer and naturalist Henry David Thoreau, described evil as a lurking reptile of real form, such as the account of the serpent in the Garden of Evil. However, like the 18th century Christian optimists, Thoreau saw the vices of humankind a necessity for the existence of virtue and good works. Fellow transcendentalist, Euro-American journalist, and feminist Margaret Fuller believed, like the optimists too, that evil to be good in the grand scheme of things. Fuller believed in the cultivation of self-reliance specifically so that individuals could resist evil. The optimists were certainly winning out in our optimistic Unitarian faith. In 1887, the Western Conference of the American Unitarian Association adopted a statement of the things most commonly believed among us, penned by Euro-American Unitarian minister Reverend William Channing Gannett, which included a section about evil. We believe that good and evil inevitably carry their own recompense, no good thing being failure and no evil thing success. That heaven and hell are states of being, that no evil can befall the good person in either life or death, that all things work together for the victory of the good. We believe that we ought to join hands and work to make good things better and the worse good, counting nothing good for self that is not good for all. As mentioned before, these statements also reflected the optimist belief of Reverend James Freeman Clarke in the progress of humankind onward and upward forever. It's also worth mentioning that Gannett and Clarke are the first UUs we've discussed who were not living in Greater Boston, though Gannett was born in Boston and Clarke died there, and that in these things commonly believed, there was only one statement about God at all, reflecting a shift in Unitarianism toward humanistic agnosticism and atheism. In the early 20th century, social gospel preachers in both Universalism and Unitarianism echoed Lydia Maria Child's and Theodore Parker's beliefs about social sin. Jesus' death by crucifixion, carried out by an imperialist empire, was held up as the principal example of how social sins are the cause of evil in our world. In 1917, the Universalist Church of America adopted Euro-American Universalist minister and professor Reverend Clarence Skinner's Declaration of Social Principles, which included that, while in no wise minimizing the responsibility of the individual for their own life, we denounce as superstition the teaching that we are led into sin by inherent depravity, as by devils of an unseen world. But we hold it to be self-evident that humankind is led into sin by evil surroundings, by the evils of unjust social and economic conditions, which condemn one to be born in the squalor and filth of the slums, and another amidst the equally demoralizing influences of unearned luxury. The Universalist Church of America's 1935 affirmation of faith also strongly suggests the more classical Unitarian belief in free will and ongoing progress. We avow our faith in the hope in the power of people of goodwill and sacrificial spirit to overcome all evil and progressively establish the kingdom of God. The two denominations gradually aligning theologies of evil was one of many signs that they would eventually merge. Two of the great Unitarian process theologians and philosophers of the mid-20th centuries, Euro-American professors, Reverend Dr. Henry Nelson Wyman and Dr. Charles Hartshorne, took up the problem of evil in their broader theological works. Because process theologians do not believe in the classic omnipotence of God, but instead that God affects and is affected, that God teaches and learns, their explanations of evil avoid the how do we get the ball from this three-legged stool problem. In Wyman's book, The Source of Human Good, he starts off his chapter on good and evil, denying the Augustinian theodicy. He wrote, "Evil is not negative in the sense of being the mere absence of good, for particular instances of evil are powerful and aggressive. Evil is a definite and specifiable character of evils. It is what obstructs or destroys the good." Both Wyman and Hartshorne also disagreed with the optimist's view that God required evil to make an optimal world. Wyman wrote, "If evil is not truly evil is true, then our war against evil becomes a kind of sardonic joke." Comparing God to a good parent, Charles Hartshorne explained that God's power is not to direct and control all human action, but instead to help humans more and more decide their own behavior as their intelligence grows. That means, Hartshorne argued, that while deity may have created our world as having the greatest opportunity for good, humanity was not created to automatically choose most optimally. While the best of all possible worlds is possible, it requires humanity's ongoing and freely chosen growth. In the latter part of the 20th century, the ministers and professors, Reverend Dr. William Jones and Reverend James Luther Adams, were our primary Unitarian Universalist thinkers on evil. Especially during and in the wake of World War II, Adams rejected polarizing theologies that creation is either essentially good or essentially evil, believing that the possibility for both lies in free human decision and action. He wrote that vice and virtue cannot exist disembodied from interpersonal institutional forms, and that all good and evil things have social incarnation. Without constant reflection on personal character and motivations in the social context, Adams believed a person could be easily lost to evil. And Adams believed that as long as liberal religion avoided acknowledging evil and sin, it would never achieve its potential as a truly life-changing force in the world. Reflecting on the Black Church and its roots in enslavement by European Christians, Reverend Dr. Bill Jones constructed a scathing critique of Black Christian theologians in his major work on the problem of evil, Is God a White Racist? He believed that in light of centuries of ethnic suffering of Black people around the world, it is impossible to believe that an omnipotent God is not racist. For him, the problem of evil is solved only by removing or greatly mitigating theistic belief, thus placing responsibility on evil's true source, the actions of human beings. Jones does not presume to know whence evil comes, but he does seek the most accurate explanation of ethnic suffering. Jones's rejection of an omnipotent God reflects a further shift in Unitarian Universalist theology post-merger toward atheism and agnosticism. Instead of theodicy, evil in and of itself, regardless of any God, becomes the focus of our questioning. After the turn of this century and bringing us into the present, UU Methodist minister and professor Reverend Dr. Rebecca Ann Parker has been one of our stronger theologians writing about evil. Parker is most concerned with systemic oppression and what we as people of faith will do about it. She considers traditional inquiries into the problem of evil to be impractical intellectual exercises. She writes, more important than the why are the questions such as, what evil is going on here and now? How can it be stopped? How can human beings be liberated from their captivity to it? Parker herself believes that the evil going on here and now is operating as fraud, pomp, and greed, manifests as large-scale systems that effectively disrupt and deny basic human needs, disrupts human longings for recognition and connection, exploits resources without replenishment, and maintains social order through treating human beings with violence. Parker has also written extensively about the dangers of traditional Christian atonement theology that valorizes suffering, particularly in the context of war and domestic violence. She writes, when this theological perspective that Jesus' death on the cross was a saving event by the will of God, when that perspective prevails, the violence and abuse that human beings experience or perpetuate become valorized as necessary and good for the salvation of the world. Parker certainly does not follow the theology of the Christian optimist, requiring some human suffering in the best of all possible worlds. In an expression of religious humanism similar to Bill Jones, Parker writes that because humans are the cause of suffering in the world, we should be the ones to save it. Okay, so now we've reviewed where we've come from as Unitarian Universalists and who we are as Unitarian Universalists regarding our views of evil. So the last question is, where are we going? Robust Unitarian Universalist understandings of evil and of the divine could help ameliorate or eliminate moral evils, spurring our people and others to action and advocacy. We need not be unprepared when evil crosses the threshold into our congregations and even into our own hearts. So what is a Unitarian Universalist theology for today? A theology of evil for today? Though Unitarian Universalists throughout the denomination may not share a specific theodicy, we certainly care about what to do about evil. 4 overarching themes dominate modern responses to the presence of evil in our world. First, Unitarian Universalists are interested in the origins of evil and often place those origins in human freedom, internal shortcomings, privations of virtue, and those issues manifesting in systems. Second, we are critiquing damaging conceptions of God and creating new understandings of the divine that empower humankind. UUs have rejected notions of evil that result in blaming victims for their oppression and pain or excusing their suffering in the light of a divine plan. Third, we see evil most manifest in oppression, violence, othering, selfishness, hatred, self-righteousness, false divisions between groups of people and between humans and other living beings, and ignorance, particularly of and within systems of privilege and oppression. Lastly, Unitarian Universalists hope to live as justice-making people, breaking down barriers and building up beloved community. Through the UU Service Committee and UU State Action Networks, our Side with Love campaign, the UUA itself, and our General Assembly's statements of conscience and actions of immediate witness, we declare to the world that we identify goodness as loving and reconciling relationships, and evil as hatred and discrimination. Modern liberation theologians advise us that the full inclusion of our members and engagement with the larger community are key to discerning what is good and what is evil. Theological declarations and sacred activism should not be decided by an individual or even small committees, but in community dialogue across many barriers of identity and background with great reflection and prayer. This means that while UU writers and preachers on evil historically have almost all been educated and economically stable white cis men, our modern theologies of evil need to be created within a much more diverse community of thinkers. Like all aspects of Unitarian Universalist theology, our understandings of evil should be under constant reflection for what is permanent and what is transient, also from Theodore Parker. It's important for us, too, to understand the power of labeling something, or worse, someone, as evil. Our faith's universalist history asks us to love all beings as God, in the universalist conception, loves all beings, even though they may do evil works. Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker says it well. We need our theology to be strong enough to assist us in facing evil. We need it to accompany us and guide us when violence breaks our hearts and severs the bonds on which life depends. We need it to help us find our way through the long nights of pain when we have to discern how, in the aftermath of violence, life might be repaired, the perpetuators of violence stopped and held to account, and the escalating cycles of retaliation and revenge ended. We need our theology to speak to and from the experiences of the ashes. Thank you all so much for your time and attention tonight. On this last slide, which we'll leave up or share separately in some way, you'll see many recommended resources for further reading, a few of which I've already mentioned. And now I believe we are able to open up for questions. Sarah Elizabeth, how do you suggest we have this? What do we do with this giant reading list that I created? Oh, I see boxes.
Sorry, I was working on 2 screens and they were not listening to me about what should be on what screen. So I had a moment of and then I went and muted myself by accident while I tried to add my spotlight. So good to see all of you. That was wonderful, Reverend Catie. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I will share in the chat now all of those, like just sort of copy and paste the text so everyone can see that. But I will also, it won't be formatted well on here, just so you know. I will also post it to the church blog as well. So you'll be able to find it there later, as well as in the notes on the YouTube video when we upload it there. So that's where you can find the text that Reverend Catie has been so wonderful to suggest. And then that we're heading into questions for Reverend Catie, questions and discussion. We have a decent sized group, not too many tonight. So I would say if you would like to verbally ask Reverend Catie your question, feel free to raise your little Zoom hand or indicate in the chat that you'd like to ask a question, or you can just type your question in the chat and I'll help regulate flow of conversation, make sure we have a little lineup going. So with that, does anybody have an initial question or wondering? I see a hand over there. Here we go. There.
Go ahead. You can go. Okay. Oh, me? Okay. Catie, what do you think of that? I mean, there's a quote, I think it's either from Shakespeare or Ben Franklin, that there is no good or bad. It's only thinking that makes it so. I've often thought about that myself, for a long time. And at times I think it makes sense. Other times it does not. Does that, sorry if I'm being a little nebulous.
No, I'm not familiar with that particular quote, but to try to answer what I think about it, that sounds similar to how theologians and philosophers have dealt with natural evil,
Right.
but not really how we deal with moral evil.
Right.
That actually in human behavior, we have the ability to ascertain what is good and what is evil, whether that comes from eating an apple or a pomegranate in the Garden of Eden or not. That is something we are able to do. Our thinking certainly does make it so, but also we are a thinking species. So that's my my thought on that. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with that, Phil,
Thank you.
Your question.
Well, I had a similar question to Jonathan's. The idea of what makes something good or evil, of where am I coming from? Who gets to decide, and how do we as individuals personally decide what particular action or circumstance fits into which category. And there's a whole lot of stuff out there that is both. The whole yin and yang stuff that's bound up together. What comes to mind is something as simple as debate over veganism and vegetarianism, and is it evil to eat meat? Well, when a tiger eats meat, I don't think tigers have any sense of good or evil. They are what they are, and they do what they do. And we as human beings are carnivores from our origins, and yet we are somehow aware of the suffering that we can cause. And there's something about the thinking making it so says to me, when you're aware of, or maybe there's a piece of intention about your action, if you're trying to cause suffering, or anyway, you see where I'm going with this? There's sort of a relativism about good and evil. What you think is evil may not be what I think is evil, and vice versa, good as well. So I think it's a lost effort, or what was the thing, a sardonic joke, to try and cast an answer to that question in concrete, when it's going to be evolving as society's norms evolve, and it's going to grow as we individuals grow in our understanding of human relations and the universe.
Yeah. Oh, and so Phil, I think I've got 3 things to say in response to that. We'll see if I can remember all of them by the time I'm done. So thank you for your thoughts on this, and relativism, moral relativism. So one is that it was actually Bill Jones, who I referenced in the presentation, who wrote "Is God a White Racist?" He I can't remember if it was in that book or other writings. He specifically talks about how dangerous it can be to label something, and especially someone, as evil, because we've seen in the past how that's gone very awry, and not even in the distant past, but an easy example is our friends up in Salem, hanging people, squishing them, etc., because they were witches. They I don't know, weren't like that, more likely than not. So it is dangerous to label. We have to be very open to new information coming in. That might change how we think of an action or an institution as being good or evil. The world is very complex. It's not so easily divisible. Because I am a vegetarian, I feel like it's important for me to note that cats are 100% carnivores, that they die if they don't eat meat, whereas I'm not dead. So take that, Phil. No, so I'm not. I will be eventually. Probably not from vegetarianism. We'll see. I might just get so sleepy from lack of iron. We'll see how it goes. But that goes back to, again, that question of moral evil versus natural evil. That I don't know. Like, cats are just evolved to be carnivores, so a tiger has to eat meat, and it does cause suffering. In the Jain religious tradition, they talk about how even eating plants is it's causing pain to a plant. It just might not be the kind of pain we associate with eating a cow or a pig. So that's a whole complicated question as well. The last thing is, this seems like a nice moment to recommend, as Sarah Elizabeth's already heard me done, I think, in a couple other contexts, the television show The Good Place. Because if you would like to watch a funny television show that was on just regular network TV somehow, that is about how you decide what's good and evil, and how complicated that can get in the modern world, that is a good show to watch. Maybe some of you have already seen it, but it essentially takes you on a journey from a universe ordered by Unitarian theology into a universe organized by Universalist theology. Which one, Sarah Elizabeth? Not ultra universe. Restorationist universalism. That is the word I was looking for. So, hi, Sarah Elizabeth. Phil, were my ramblings what you were. Was that adequate? I know the
Were those the ramblings you were hoping for from Reverend Katie? Is what she's trying to ask.
Yeah.
Well, yes, it's a starting point. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Phil.
All right, we have another hand raised before we move to a question in the chat. And with that, Peter, I would love to add you to our chat here.
Oh, and I see. Yeah, Charles has a question too. I also want to thank Sarah Elizabeth. I was also looking for that word. I was like, what's the word when they're just super carnivores? Obligate carnivores. Anyway, and Charles, we'll get to your question after Peter has a chance to ask his.
Love the good place, yes. So my question was, I'm curious, do you trace anything in modern UU circles back to the Gnostic or Platonist ideas of evil, where some even thought that the material universe was inherently flawed or evil, and maybe created by an evil non-God creator or something?
Yeah. Is that are we talking about Manichaeism? Manichaeism? We might be. Sarah Elizabeth, could you Google Manichaeism for me and see if that's what we're talking about?
I would love to. You should know I can't spell, so.
Gnosticism is what I'm talking about.
No. Gnosticism is one thing. Manichaeism is, if that's spelled correctly, which I'm sure it's not, but it's close. Anyway, there's an early Christian.
I think there's a second N in there.
It's Manichaean. I don't know.
I have the correct. I think you got it right. I think you got it right.
I would love that. I would love if I remembered this random.
It is a dualistic religious system with Christian, Gnostic, and pagan elements founded in Persia in the 3rd century. Yeah, it was based on a supposed primeval conflict with light and darkness. Yeah. Is that helpful? Is that what you were looking for, Reverend?
That's
Kate?
great. Yeah, sorry, Peter. When you were describing, I was like, I think that's Manichaeism, but I haven't thought about that in maybe a decade. So that's just my brain keeping some very interesting stuff around. Not pruning at all. So okay. Gnosticism. So the thing is, Peter, here's the thing. Our religious tradition, like of what our 19th century version of Unitarianism and Universalism, was so heavily repressed until the Protestant Reformation, and it still wasn't great in Europe. As I mentioned, Miguel Serveto was burned at the stake on green wood, so he would cook slowly. It actually stopped burning at the stake altogether in Europe because instead of being entertaining, people thought it was gross. That's one of my favorite facts to tell coming of age kids, by the way. Sarah Elizabeth, you can wait on that. I love telling them about Miguel Serveto. So the Gnostic Gospels were also very much repressed. I mean, we didn't even know about them until like the 20th century in like real form. They were like, oh, here they are in a container in a cave. Elaine Pagels, actually, her primary study as a scholar is in the Gnostic Gospels. So you might have fun reading her stuff. So I can't say that actually any of our theologies of evil come from these other forms of heretical Christianity, and particularly ones that we've really only rediscovered in the last century or so. But like Unitarianism, Manichaeism was also highly repressed starting in apparently the 4th century CE, as the Roman Emperor Constantine started asking. Oh, see Elaine Pagels. Oh, she's great. Wait, no, that the Many Faces of Evil Historical Perspectives by somebody else. Elaine Pagels wrote.
Oh, so I misread the list Sarah Elizabeth copy pasted. I see.
You're okay. Everything's fine. Yeah, she wrote a book, I think, literally called The Gnostic Gospels, and I can't remember. The Gospel of Judas, is that also hers? I don't remember. Because all of these alternate ideas of Christian theology were so heavily repressed, I mean, there were like, when you really dive into the history of Unitarianism and Universalism, you'll find like heretical, like secret heretical priests, like copying documents. But for example, our Universalist, the first Universalist, Origen, who didn't even say, oh, I definitely believe in Universalism, but wrote that essentially he wrote that perhaps because God is just, there would be a transmigration of souls that we might be reincarnated, so we would have enough chances to get into heaven by getting it right eventually. We only have one of his many writings left, and he was extremely well read from like the 2nd century through the 6th century when he was finally condemned as a heretic. He was extremely influential, was considered a church father, and then they're like, oh nope, this universalist thing, we're getting rid of it. But yeah, all these councils, starting with Emperor Constantine really wanting Christianity to be a religion that he could utilize as an emperor, I don't know, that suppressed a lot. Does that answer your question? That was also a bunch of ramblings. Sorry.
No, it was great.
Okay, great.
Wonderful. Well, then let me read out loud the question we had in the chat, which was from the wonderful Charles Thomas. Have Unitarians, Universalists, and UUs understood a difference between evil and bad, or were and are the terms considered synonymous?
I don't know, Charles. I personally don't think of bad in theological terms, like badness. Maybe that's because, again, as a millennial American, like I grew up with like Michael Jackson's Bad, which was actually good. I grew up in the 90s, so but I would think, I don't know, the tone I think with these two words, evil being something much more serious theologically and philosophically, whereas bad might be an issue of taste, is what I think about. I remember this was years ago. I preached a sermon I very much enjoyed doing on like the 5 senses and how it's evidence that we don't even experience the same world. And so we should always, hold our perspectives and opinions lightly, because I don't know, blue is a made-up color. I remember I started that by saying that olives are really gross because they taste bad. And so, and people have different opinions about that. But I don't think olives are evil.
I might think olives are evil, but I have very strong feelings about olives, Reverend Catie.
Yeah, because they're gross. Thank you. Oh, gosh.
I wanted to ask a sort of extension to Charles's question, if I could, which is, there have been times, and there still are sort of religious communities that use evil and bad synonymously, because like any misstep according to like the moral compass, right, like is evil. And I wonder, like, how do you reckon with that idea? Like, if you are talking to someone else with a fundamentally different idea of maybe what evil is, like, I don't know if that makes sense. It's sort of a nebulous question as a continuation.
Well, there is, this kind of, I think, goes back to what Phil was asking in terms of like, well, how do you know what evil is? And part of that is knowing, having a guiding star of values. So thinking about our national denomination's work to update, edit, etc., our principles and sources, to not have the 7 or 8 principles anymore and to have something different. I think there's still 7 of them, which is nice of them. It makes it much easier. But that they say quite strongly in the new document that's being proposed, that love is the center of what we're doing, and who we are as Unitarian Universalists. And there are other theological systems where that is not the center. And so conversations that we might have across religious differences on good and evil, we might be talking past each other, because like, well, that doesn't, such and such that you think is evil, I don't think is evil because my centering value is love, whereas your centering value might be control. Particularly if you believe in a classically triple omni God who is in control of everything. As the Augustinian theodicy says, that any sin, no matter how small, is cause for eternal damnation. That doesn't fit in a framework of a theological framework that's centered on love, but it does make sense in a theological framework that centers on control, or on rules. which again, as a covenantal tradition, that's not what we're doing together. So is that what you're asked? Do you have a question?
Yeah, no, that was
Okay.
a great answer. Yeah, good job. I
Ew,
do like you're checking in with everyone. That's very I thought we were all getting our questions asked.
Yeah.
I
do also want to say that Charles likes olives, and that's bad.
We'll let you stay here for now, Charles, but we might have to talk about it later. I'm not
We'll
sure.
have to talk about it.
We have different centering values when it comes to olives. But no, I haven't seen any additional hands or questions, but I did see that the lovely Gail Lehman said that she had a comment. So Gail, I don't know if you wanted to type that in the chat. There you go.
Yeah, your thing about JB and Archibald MacLeish, that was the play that in my senior year that was done at my school. And at the end, after all these horrible things happen to JB, who is Job.
Oh, because it's Job. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
I should have said that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the play, he's called JB. He's a big banker and, has all this, and everything is taken, and there's bombs and disease, and his wife, at the end, his wife is about to leave him. Yeah. And then she comes back with a branch of forsythia. And she says to Job, God does not love, he is, but we do. That's the wonder. Isn't that a beautiful ending? I don't know if that's the very end, but then our director had Satan laugh at the end, which is not in the play. But
yeah.
It made me think of that and how, you says, love is the basis.
Yeah. And thank you so much, Gail. I actually haven't read that play. And so I actually, and if I take this presentation on the road, I should at least add in that it's about Job. But what a wonderful, that is truly a wonderful ending. And Job and his wife in the Bible also have a lot of arguments. I don't know if this is reflected in the play. His wife is constantly like, why don't you just give up and curse God? Obviously everything's terrible. Yeah. He killed all of our kids. So is that also happened in the play where she's like,
oh yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes sense.
Get raped, they go to war, get blown up. Yeah. Everything.
Yeah.
It's a modern version of Job.
Yes. Fascinating. That was done at your high school. I don't know if many high schools are doing plays like that anymore. Because there's a lot of theology in there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that comment. We can say that I can add that to my recommendations about The Good Place. I can also tell folks, if you could find a show of JB, you should go watch that too.
Well,
yeah. Well, that's yeah. That can be our serious feeling sad recommendation versus The Good Place, which will make you laugh even as it makes you think. Yeah.
Thank you, Gail. Phil has his hand up again, coming back for seconds.
Well, I wanted more information about this idea of natural evil, disasters and evil, because I have this concept that for something to be evil, it has to have intentionality. And natural disasters don't have intentionality. Maybe they can be exacerbated by human actions that do have intentionality. But, so a volcano blows up,
yeah.
How can that be called evil? Even if the whole city of Pompeii is, wiped out, it just is, So what did you mean by natural evil?
That's actually exactly what I mean by natural evil is a volcano or a hurricane, or disease that is just it. Actually, Gail, like you said, God just is. Viruses are, so it's not. That is my sermon topic for this Sunday, Phil.
Oh, okay.
So I can't say any more about it now.
All
but,
right. Watch this space.
You have to tune in on Sunday.
Tune in on Sunday. But you're right that it's an interesting quandary for philosophers and theologians to deal with, especially the idea of if this is the best of all possible worlds, why are there earthquakes? like, oh, it's so we can save people from the rubble. So it's all of these things are connected because human beings react to natural evils and as we all know, contribute to them in various ways. So we'll get into that more on Sunday. But truly, most of particularly theology of evil has focused on moral evil because it has intentionality or a cause, whereas volcanoes erupt sometimes.
Right.
Yeah.
So in my world of atheism, where the universe is chaotic and things just are, human beings are always trying to create order out of chaos. And the one miracle I recognize is that life is actually an organizing force, and that's a miracle I will accept. But I don't really see that good and evil even are a thing in the perspective of the cosmos. It's like stars do their whatever physics says they do. They're not intentionally creating black holes and sucking other stars in and so forth. It's like, anyway, I look forward to your sermon.
Oh, thank you. Well, and you can go back to that comic that Peter helped us share from Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal, as you're offering skepticism, the beauty of doesn't give a crap about you cosmos.
Right.
It's a great alternative. You're right, because the stars, they don't mind. Well, and this is I think a tension in philosophy and theology of evil, is that on the one hand, from a cosmic perspective, none of this really matters. Eventually the sun is going to blow up and then there won't be any human beings if we don't off ourselves earlier. So maybe it doesn't matter. But right now, evil actually really does matter to all of these conscious beings that are on our planet presently. So there is a tension there. So looking at the long view and like, well, now but we do actually exist in the present moment. And we experience things that cause trauma and suffering. And so what do we do about those things? Even if it doesn't matter in millions of years, what do we do about it right now for the people who could be experiencing joy, but instead are experiencing grief and sadness?
I related most directly to that final Reverend Dr. Parker. Is that her name?
Yes.
Her perspective is along that line.
Yeah, I think you would like, so in the book list are a couple of hers and Rita Nakashima Brock. They've done a couple of good books together. One about Saving Paradise, how Christianity traded the I don't know, heaven for the cross. Where is that? I'm like just scanning back up. Yeah, how Christianity traded love for this world for crucifixion and empire. That's a nice history book. And then Proverbs of Ashes, violence, redemptive suffering, and the search for what saves us. So you might like her her work. And there you could also, she's done a lot of articles and things like that as well, if you just wanted to dip a toe in first instead of going to the library.
Thanks.
Yeah. And it looks like Ross has a question as well.
If I
Yes,
could
thank
just
you. I
jump-
came back to excuse me, go ahead.
Oh no, you go ahead. I will
All right.
add you right
I
here.
will. I came back to the quote that Phil brought up. There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. It's from Shakespeare's Hamlet. And in this context of the volcano or something that doesn't have any intentionality, it seems like what we might be doing is, if we want to think that something is evil, we might give it more attention. Like if we treated the virus as if it were evil, it's so dangerous, it's so new, it's it has to be treated in an extreme way. So if we treated it as evil, it might serve a function of like this is bringing greater attention to something that's really serious. It's just a twist on the quote. Thinking something evil, I mean, it's sort of, if it's arbitrary, if thinking makes everything what it is, and then let's start defining what is evil in order to direct ourselves in maybe into a better future. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it was Jonathan who brought that up. He was thinking it was Hamlet's. He was thinking it was Shakespeare. So now we know it's from Hamlet. We're going back to Shakespeare. It's full circle with Macbeth at the beginning. Yeah. And Ross, I absolutely agree that we have to think about these things in the short term, because there are people suffering right now from real pain, real suffering, real trauma. And we can label that as evil. We just have to be cautious about it, because when you label something as evil, that has, as you're saying, it has a lot of weight to it. So we, particularly as Unitarian Universalists, because we recognize that our theology and our theologies are evolving, and that we don't have all the answers, and there's no central authority giving us all the answers. We do have practice, and we do have the challenge to remain open that maybe what we think is evil is not, is just is an opinion. Maybe it's just bad. So it's
it doesn't mean that it's not that it's benign. Something that is really dangerous and troublesome, hazardous, a threat to health and safety, and so forth. You might as well call it evil, if you want to have some more additional focus. Bring all our faculties to bear, even a religious connotation.
Well, and that is
lay it on them.
Having a public theology is that's what James Luther Adams was advocating for in the wake of World War II and into the late 20th century. That Unitarianism and then Unitarian Universalism after the merger have an imperative. We have an imperative to have public theology that expresses what we think is good and what we think is evil. But again, Bill Jones, he cautions us, don't get too stuck on your ideas of good and evil, because you may accidentally be just perpetuating evil yourself. So you don't want to be too cavalier about it. No.
Thank you so much, Ross.
I don't know.
Well, I have an example of what I've thought of as an evil, but Becky and Vin, go ahead. I've been talking too much.
I just want to put some tension around the question of this matter of intentionality or labeling something because you think it is X or Y. I think thinking slavery is good doesn't make it so.
Yeah. Well, I think
there are some things that I assume, well, I shouldn't say this because I suppose there are people on earth who believe slavery is a good thing.
Well, there certainly were in the 1800s.
There are today.
Yeah. And that, I think, it's actually the theology of slavery and enslavement is actually a great example of mislabeling things as good or evil, because actually on both sides, abolitionists and people who were pro-enslavement, they had religious supporters, both of them, citing things from the Bible. These were mostly Christians having this debate in the United States, of course. And for folks who supported enslavement, they say they were like, well, slavery's in the Bible, which it is, and that because one of their core values was evangelism, and frankly, paternalism, this idea of European supremacy, they're like, well, we're really saving these indigenous and African folks, is they wouldn't be able to live good Christian lives without us. Yeah. And that was a real argument from the pulpit. So it's a great example of how we need to be careful with labeling good and evil, because I think that if more folks then had been in dialogue with indigenous and enslaved people and were not centering evangelism or Christian and European supremacy, they would have realized more quickly that they were wrong. So, and it's we haven't found particular evidence of this, but our own founding pastor, Reverend Jonathan Townsend, was an enslaver, and he clearly had no qualms about that. He enslaved this man Homer for 40 years. And I imagine it was because, again, especially in the 16 and 1700s, there were very few white abolitionists, European descent, origin abolitionists.
Coincidentally, Reverend Catie, I was reading something, it was from the Congressional Record from 1857, leading up to the Civil War, of course, and there were huge discussions justifying slavery on the floor of Congress. And one of the arguments was the power of, and they referred to the Latin word manus, M-A-N-U-S, which was not the power of the man, but the power of the hand, the strong hand. And that was the justification. If you were able to sustain the power of the hand, if you were the stronger person, that was the justification. But it didn't justify killing the slave. The slavery was viewed as unnatural by this one speech, that slavery came about because of the unnatural state war. And if you captured somebody, it was against your theology and religion, whatever, to kill the prisoner. So it had to become, that person had to become a slave. And that's how slavery started, by this one person's justification. But it was the strong man argument, which people still buy into, authoritarianism. And I'm seeing it in public housing, exactly this sort of thing. And I want to label it as an evil in that regard, but it's something that people find justifiable. It's they see it as a way to manage other people, and they employ what I would view as really offensive, objectionable, oppressive, manipulative kind of tactics, and they view it as management.
Yeah, well, and that is that goes back to an ethic or a theology of control, which is an alternate starting place for a theology. And Vin, I wanted to, because I jumped in, I wanted to make sure that I answered your inquiry or responded properly.
I just wanted to, make the point that labeling doesn't make it so.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's yeah, so you're against that but the Hamlet argument, thinking makes it
Very
so.
much so.
Well, I'd be interested if somebody wants to look it up later, the context, what part of Hamlet that's from. Yeah, I could say that the Macbeth quote I use, something wicked this way comes. It's one of the witches. We like them. They're fun. The witches, it was Macbeth coming, because he was bad. Wicked even. Sorry, Charles, I don't want to use bad for Macbeth. The Scottish play. Clearly he was a big mess. Okay. Yeah.
Well, we have reached about the end of our time. The only thing I was trying to add earlier that I really, and I appreciate this comment from Samar, the Hamlet quote has reverberations of authoritarian apologia to me, which I think is pretty accurate. I think something I've noticed in a lot of this discussion, Reverend Catie, is like so much nuance, right? Like we talk about evil as this really big monolith of an idea, and it can feel that way culturally, but really like evil is very nuanced. And I think our history reflects that. So I really appreciate that. And there are some arguments to be made that like natural evil is like beyond our understanding and even at times imagination as well. Like germ theory didn't exist until about 200 years ago. Before that, we thought like sickness was evil spirits, right? But like germs, if you think about it, sound just about as unbelievable as evil spirits causing illness. Like if you don't have a way to believe that, right? Yeah. I've become recently fascinated with this plant that's called a mimic plant, that for a long time, like they've noticed that this plant will adjust its leaves to match the leaves of other plants near it, so that it blends in, so that it doesn't stick out and maybe is more vulnerable. And there have been lots of theories as to how this happens, like maybe the plant reads the DNA of the other plant, like maybe it's connecting. And recently, like in a study, they found that this plant began mimicking a plastic plant that it was not in physical contact with. And so there's this idea that now being talked about of, can plants see? Like if plants see, like what is that? Like, so can volcanoes be evil? Maybe volcanoes have intentions we don't know about, right? Like, and as crazy as that sounds, like, there's so much beyond our understanding at all times, no matter how much we love and are dedicated to science. And I think that's like a really interesting thing to keep in mind as well, that all of this just often goes beyond understanding, which is not to be a negative or positive thing. It is a thing.
Yeah. Well, and that is, I think, that an important part of our current 6 sources is that our source about science is actually about idolatry. That, and even science can become idolatrous. Is there are all sorts of things that used to be scientifically true, and that are not anymore. But that's part of the work of science, is like digging deeper, and we have new technology, greater understanding, but never the total understanding, which is exactly what God said to Job. So I guess that's there we go. We solved it. There goes that's the solution.
We solved it. We solved good and evil. Thanks for coming, everyone. You can say you were in the room where it happened. But really and truly, Reverend Catie, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Everyone, you know, she does a show each week, Sunday, 10:30 at First Parish in Needham. Feel free to come in person, or we do stream to YouTube and on Zoom every Sunday. And with that, I will play our playlist as people filter out. But thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Reverend Catie, for doing this for us.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for being here. It was it's